Another story of Rwanda's brutal history, documented in detail by journalist Judy Reaver in her book titled In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Reaver's extensive research documents another mass slaughter, a second genocide, one carried out by Kagame's army. On the program today, a feature interview with Judy Reaver. We'll also hear a perspective from Kigali, Rwanda, and from an international human rights advocate. But we begin with Judy Reaver. You argue in your book that there was not one genocide in Rwanda, but two. Tell me how. What does that mean? Two genocides. That's not the official history.
What I tell in my book is after the Hutu president, Habyarimana, was assassinated, Paul Kagame and his high command and training wing and military intelligence got together and sent out in the field groups of mobile forces. They did this clandestinely, and they started in the north where they were already present and in areas they had already seized, and they quickly proceeded to go down the eastern flank of the country to the south and then back up. April, as soon as the plane crash occurred, they seized territory rapidly, and behind the front, these mobile forces operated. What they did was they called Hutu peasants and Hutu community leaders to meetings. They would lure them, put them on buses. They took these people to mainly a place called Akagera Park, and they shot them and burnt the bodies there. So this was an elaborate scheme that was hard to see because, quite frankly, journalists were not in those areas.
So while the genocide was being perpetrated against the Tutsis, and the numbers ranged between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsis being killed, you're saying the same genocide was being carried out against the Hutus themselves by the so-called leader of the victims of the genocide.
Yes. Leader of the victims that's contentious, or you know, I might disagree with that, but yes, that's what was happening. Certainly Tutsis were targeted systematically in zones that were controlled by Hutu elements, and they were systematically targeted mainly by Hutu militias. So there's no doubt that there was a genocide against Tutsis. The hidden violence, the violence that most people did not realize was happening in those zones that were controlled quite quickly by the Rwandan Patriotic Front and its army.
By Kagame's army.
Absolutely.
And how many victims were there of the Hutu genocide?
The way in which these killing squads operated gives an idea of the scale and scope of the killing and the victims. So we've had these estimates come from former soldiers, Kagame's former soldiers, and also his former officers, but a few people at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Investigators who looked at some of these killings, and they've said at least 500,000 Hutus would have been killed or more by Kagame's army during the genocide from April to July 1994 and in the months after.
In the beginning, you were there like other journalists, as you mentioned earlier. At what point did you realize that you were covering a different story than the genocide against the Tutsis?
I wasn't in Rwanda during the genocide, but I got a glimpse. First of all, I felt that there was a baptism by fire regarding who the Rwandan Patriotic Front was and how they operated. I got a sense of that in Congo. Right after Mobutu fell, President Mobutu Sese Seko was toppled by Kagame's troops in '97. So I went there a couple of days after that overthrow, and I went into the Congolese jungle with humanitarian workers who were local Congolese. And we were there, these were search and rescue missions, we were there to find survivors, Hutu refugee survivors, people who had been attacked and chased from eastern Congo to western Congo. So I was in the forest south of Kisangani, and we found survivors, and they told me those stories. They told me the stories of how they'd been chased and their family members had been killed, slaughtered in the jungle. I had no idea that Kagame, who was at that point being elevated to a status of a leader of an African Renaissance, that his troops had actually done this. But they did, and it was systematic, and I interviewed one person after another, and I saw these children. So then I realized, okay, something's wrong. From there, I started to ask more questions about why they had fled to Congo, first of all.
Why the Hutus had fled.
Exactly, why the Rwandan Hutus had fled, and why they stayed in Zaire, which was renamed Congo, why they wouldn't go back home. And it was then, during those interviews, but also months later, listening to my tape, that I started to understand that there was a whole other part of history that I hadn't heard of.
You basically talk about a cover-up. Who's responsible for that cover-up?
Well, the way in which the cover-up occurred is an interesting story, but the West is basically responsible. Powerful insiders at the United Nations, people in the US government who have covered for Kagame for many years. One of the first glimpses of the violence and the voices that were raised, the alarm, was during the genocide. There was a UN cable, for example, that was issued in May about Hutu peasants being chased and slaughtered by Kagame's army in May 1994 at the height of the genocide. And that cable must have been known to the UN peacekeeping force.
So must have been known to Romeo Dallaire, you said?
Absolutely. There is no doubt in my mind that that report, which was then handed to Refugees International and other NGOs, there's no doubt that that testimony and those stories of Hutus being slaughtered, burned, and chased into Tanzania, and then their bodies, the bodies of people who died, were dumped in the Akagera River. There's no doubt that the UN knew.
The tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal as well, you suggest had elements of this story but didn't investigate?
Well, the tribunal was set up in the aftermath of the genocide to investigate and try the most serious crimes. And obviously it was hard to investigate the crimes that Kagame's troops carried out while in Rwanda under Kagame's thumb, while his regime was consolidating power after the genocide. The UN needed to investigate what the Hutu génocidaires had committed, what crimes they had committed. And at the same time, they set up a clandestine unit to investigate the crimes committed by Kagame's troops. But that was hard to do that probe, so most of the achievements they made or investigations were actually when they got a hold of defectors who had fled to Uganda. So the best they could do was to interview these people who were fleeing from the regime, and they did do that. And they came up with a fair amount of evidence, certainly very interesting prima facie evidence, enough to issue indictments. By that time, there was a chief prosecutor at the tribunal, an Italian woman, a Swiss-Italian named Carla Del Ponte, and she announced that she would have some indictments ready. It was about 2001, 2002, within a year. And by 2003, she was removed. And she was removed because at that time, the United States had a fair amount of influence. There were no indictments against Kagame's officers, against Kagame himself, ever issued. There were no international prosecutions. So all this to say is that the United Nations buried the evidence and basically cemented his impunity.
There were other people on the ground. We mentioned Romeo Dallaire a minute ago. There were aid agencies, there were human rights investigators and other sort of independent human rights organizations. Are they complicit in this cover-up? And if so, how?
Well, there are degrees of complicity. I'm critical of the work that Human Rights Watch did in the aftermath of the genocide. I think they did an effective job of investigating the crimes of the former Hutu regime or elements of the former Hutu regime, and certainly the operations of the Interahamwe Hutu militia. So, but it seems to me that they were solely focused on that. And we were seeing what was happening is an enormous amount of propaganda at the time, that this was a catastrophe that occurred in Rwanda that was...
It was indeed.
That it was a catastrophe between good and bad forces, evil and good forces. And it was cataclysmic, it was a catastrophe, but the violence was bidirectional. And I didn't see a determined, willful, and sustained effort on the part of human rights organizations, certainly Human Rights Watch, to figure out what was happening, what had happened to Hutus in RPF zones.
I know that over the years of researching and writing this, that you have been threatened, that Kagame tried to stop you from writing this book, essentially. How were you targeted?
In 2013, when I really started to understand the methods and the nature of violence, not only the violence in Rwanda today, but certainly what Kagame and his government had hid all these years, because I had broken through to many victims and a certain number of former officers, people from the inside. Then they started harassing me at home with nightly phone calls. They started following me when I travel. So I had some security issues, but it wasn't until 2014, end of 2013, where the threats to my family started. There was a phone call to the house from an anonymous caller who threatened violence against my daughter, simulated explosions and gunshots, and used her name. That was very chilling, and so at that point the Canadian authorities started following my case, and we really ramped up security measures. But I continued to work anyhow, and by the time I did more interviews in Brussels, then it was clear to me that they really meant business. And there was one trip in particular where I arrived in Brussels and I was met by Belgian state security officials, and they told me that they had credible intelligence, credible information that the Rwandan embassy in Belgium constituted a threat to my life. The security threat was serious. It was considered severe, 3 out of 4. They didn't know when a potential attack would occur, but they thought it would. Now, I didn't know what the form of that attack would be. I didn't know what kind of violence they were planning, but we had some indication that they were laying a trap for me. So during that trip in the middle of 2014, I had bodyguards, armored Mercedes. It was surreal, but it brought home to me the level of danger that I was in doing this work. But it's still nothing compared to the kind of targeting and assassinations that Rwandans have faced, who have fled and who have tried to tell some of these stories. What I've experienced, as traumatic as it is for me, it's a drop in the bucket compared to all the voices who have been silenced in this story.
Thank you. I admire your courage and your determination.
Thank you.